Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. In the federal agent intervention over the summer to demonstrate this accidental guerrilla manifestation, the federal agents come in, they're intervening in a local thing, and you see a lot of backlash. Now in Iraq, that's what happened. You have this large presence of outsiders that are now mobilizing people against them, surely for the fact that we're outsiders in their space. And that's all on the YouTube if you want to go see that. The link's on the YouTube, but good question. So let's really quickly jump into, I know the context here is migration flows, and obviously there's a direct correlation, but you know, when you create simulations of these things, you have to create the simulation in a way that is realistic and historically accurate. And part of that is identifying what creates a refugee. Well, I don't know how far you've gotten in your readings, but there's two terms that are really key. One is what's termed an IDP, an internally displaced person. And the other is what is a refugee. And what that means is someone who is fleeing violence in their local area, but stays within their country, is called an IDP, an internally displaced person. And this is someone who, you know, when ISIS takes Fallujah, right? The citizens of Fallujah that don't want to be there, they flee to Baghdad. Now, Baghdad has to take care of them. They've got to support them. Those are IDPs. They're still within the country, but this can really strain local populations and governments that aren't prepared to handle it. Then a refugee is someone who reaches the border and crosses the border, leaving the country because of violence. And so what happens with the Syrian civil war, and we'll talk later, the Libyan civil war as well in North Africa, and these conflicts, is they begin creating massive amounts of IDPs inside the border. And then some of those hit the border, cross it, and now become problems for adjoining countries to deal with. And sometimes those refugee flows, they may go all the way out through Turkey and across the Aegean and up through Europe and end up in Norway or Sweden on the far side of Europe. And these flows and patterns have international ramifications for state level diplomacy, even if you're nowhere near the conflict. It's not like Norway is bordering Syria, but what Norway's choices are internationally in accepting refugees or not has a ripple effect along that entire line. But just we start with, how do these refugees, come into being? And this is where it gets a little sensitive, but these insurgent actors tend not to be nice people. The people who are fighting them, including the US, tend not to do nice things. And what we modeled is that, you have basically what amounts to ethnic cleansing, which is where you're trying to scare a population to move them out of the area. If you're ISIS and you are supported mainly by Arab Sunni, and you view Arab Shia or Kurdish Sunni as a threat, you want to depopulate the areas you control because it's easier for you to maintain control over there if it's all Arab Sunni. So they would attack populations, not necessarily genocide to kill them all, although there were certainly circumstances of that, but they would attack populations of Yazidi, which is a local ethnicity, Arab Shia, things like that, and they're trying to scare everyone into moving. And then you get this kind of effect of people fleeing violence. That's one way to do it. Another way is if you actually end up just, mass violence. There's lots of mass graves in Iraq and Syria that are the result of intentional genocidal efforts. But I want to be clear here. Wars are complicated, and it's not a one-sided thing. The US drops a 5,000-pound bomb and it goes off target by 500 yards. You may demolish a school. That's still, casualties. That's still going to create violence in the area to which people will react to and flee. And so, I'm talking about ISIS because that's my specialty. But in this area of Syria and Iraq during this time, you've got the Assad regime of Syria, you have Turkey, you have Russia, you have Iran under Soleimani, you have the US, France, Britain, there's a lot of people fighting in this area, and that creates this huge refugee crisis that propels these international problems and ends up having a ripple effect over all of Europe. And what I wanted to show is kind of how this plays out over the rise and partial fall from a regional. We were just looking at Syria and Iraq, but what I want to show now is a slightly larger view that focuses on refugee flows. Now, this again is refugees. They have crossed the border and left Syria and Iraq and these other areas. But I'm also, you notice now, most of this is now focused on Northern Africa. there are, and I won't go too deep into it because it could be a whole nother episode, but there are discussion. There are active insurgencies going on in Mali. AQIM, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, is there in Mali. Boko Haram is down here in Nigeria. AQAP and other Al-Qaeda affiliates are up here in Algeria. There's the Libyan civil war is going on, which is an outgrowth of the fall of Gaddafi. So these are all happening at the same time. And what you see here are these little lines with numbers. These are refugee flows per year. And these charts come from the UN Human Committee on Refugees. You know, you got 4,600, 170,000, 41,000. This is 2014. We advanced to 2015, and it doesn't look, you know, 5,000, 153,000, but over here, 850,000. So in 1 year, it jumped from not much to about 1 million people crossing from Turkey into this, and they're all coming from this Syria, Iraq region. And I'll get into after this that there are also refugees who inhabit local refugee camps in the surrounding countries. But I just want to show this flow. 2016, you now have the flow decreases from Turkey. And the reason it does that is that Europe cannot handle all these refugees. And this is where it gets more into international affairs. You're doing a class on, you know, comparative politics and international politics. The European Union cuts a check to Turkey saying, you stop the flow, we pay you money. It was a pure cash for fewer refugees. And so Turkey turns off the spigot. In international diplomacy now, Turkey has a bargaining chip it can hold over the EU at any point in time. It's got several million refugees in that country from Syria, and it can say, we're going to assist them in crossing the Aegean and entering Europe, or we can hold them back. At this point, they simply wanted money. It was a hard currency transfer, 1 billion. But as the conflict goes on, over and over again, even to the last 2 weeks, I've been talking about the Mediterranean crisis that's going on with different naval ships confronting each other in the Mediterranean over exploration rights. It's very complicated. I won't get into it. But even now, in that discussion, Turkey has this refugee chip they're using. So refugees that start in a local war, they cross a border, and obviously for humanitarian reasons, you want to have good outcomes from them, but they get pulled up into international politics and they become a bargaining chip just like anything else, unfortunately. And of course, Europe has also doesn't want the refugees in there, so they're pushing back. And then finally in 2017, you can see this was at the same time that the conflict is beginning to decline against ISIS. The refugee flows begin diminishing. But this also shows the impact of not all the refugees were coming in from Turkey. There was a huge flow coming across the Mediterranean into Italy. And you'll see a lot of these maritime rescues and maritime. There's just an issue where an Italian politician went on trial for failing to rescue refugees who subsequently died. And so there's a lot of contention, not just from Syria and Iraq, but now we're talking the conflicts in Northern Africa, sending refugees into Europe. And I'm going to pause here and see how people are doing, questions on this so far with these refugees, the types of refugees, how they're generated, where they're flowing regionally in this time period, what's happening internationally because of it.
Yeah, I have a question. What kind of ramifications did the influx of refugees from Iraq, Syria, and Turkey have on the Greek economy? Because
that's a specific question, because the Greek economy is so the Greek economy. So continue your question. Go ahead.
Okay, so I did a little bit of a report on the Greek economy, and it found you know, a bunch of underlying factors of the Greek economic collapse in, you know, the past 15 years or so, but it never really stated much on refugees. It was all either bond yield related or political affiliations, stuff like that.
Right. So this is a good point. So quick background, he's talking about the Greek economic collapse. You've got credit default swaps on their bonds. They go very high. The EU has to bail out Greece. There's contention between Germany and Greece. This is very fiscal, but this is how conflict and refugees get wrapped into everything, right? This is how they get in there. So there's this fiscal discussion. The Greek economy is getting battered. They're having protests. The Greek population is furious because they feel like they're being treated poorly. This conflict with Germany, who is going to be the large creditor bailing them out. And all of this comes into this discussion of refugees. The reason you didn't find much, I think, on the refugees is, for the most part, Greek was like, come on through and keep moving. And they kind of let them move through the country into the rest of Europe. So there's a few camps that are large, you know, very large, several 100,000. There's one on an island that I forget the name of, and there was another one that just had a major fire and has had trouble rebuilding. These are large refugee camps in Greece for Syrian and Iraqi refugees. But for the most part, Greece was simply facilitating the transfer of these refugees to further destinations. And I have a chart that will show that here in a second. But I think the reason you didn't see it is relative to everything else, the common currency dilemma of, you know, how do we manage the currency, the debt bonds and the loans and, you know, tax collection and all those issues that you probably saw in your report. Refugees were not unimportant, but they were probably a minor contributor from the cost. But just like Turkey has a bargaining chip of, we can hold these refugees or we can allow them into into the European Union, Greece has a bargaining chip. We can host these refugees because we're the closest country, but if we do, I want to see some reciprocation for my effort, or we can let them go through, and that causes ripple-on effects. So these quickly, unfortunately, refugees become, like I said, bargaining chips in international politics, the flow of refugees back and forth. Good question. Other questions on this section? Anyone want to take a guess how many refugees in total there were from the Syria-Iraq war?
Like 4 million?
That's a good number. Any other guesses? Excuse me, not guesses, estimates. So 4 million is actually the number of refugees who made it into Europe. The total was 8 million, of which 4 million settled around in the countries surrounding it. So if you think about Syria being bordered by Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, those countries are hosting several million, and the number goes up and down. And of the 8 million who left, 4 million went through Turkey eventually over time and through different routes. Some of them went through Egypt and things like that and moved into Europe and areas surrounding there. So the 4 million number is close, but it doesn't account for the entire total. And some of those have been, you know, some of the recent, Turkey has tried to push into Syria to establish a buffer zone so that they can settle refugees back inside Syria, because Turkey is hosting quite a few of these refugees, and that's an economic cost. So, but there's been an enormous number of refugees from this conflict.
Is this also fueling the aggression between Turkey and Greece right now?
Oh, Turkey and Greece have a lot of reasons to be aggressing toward each other, but this certainly isn't helping. So the Greek-Turkish history goes back a long time, and there's a whole nother discussion in there from World War I and conflicts around there and the Civil War and all that, and over Crete and all these things. But with this particular issue, it is a sore point. The two big issues between Turkey and Greece right now, I would say, and Chris, you can correct me because you've done research more recently, but it's probably refugees and then resource rights in the ocean coastal shelves, like who owns any oil or natural gas. And that goes back to a long ago law about where the borders are drawn and whether they're fair or not. But, you know, oil is money, natural gas is money, and there's a lot of contention that they're now finding new oil and natural gas deposits in the Mediterranean. Who owns those? Who gets to exploit those? That's the current crisis right now between Greece and Turkey, like going on right now as we speak, is largely related to these maritime border disputes. Secondary, I would say, was the refugees, and third is just a long history of not liking each other.
Thank you.
Good question.
I'll add another question.
Okay.
When you were talking a bit about the movement through, right, and this idea that these countries can open the spigot or close the spigot, when they're opening or closing the spigot, what does that look like? Are they just sort of shuffling? We have guards at the borders, and they're, you know, shuffling trucks across, or?
Well, a lot of it has to do with, let me just show real quick here a map that's got it's a good zoom in. So this talks about these spigots here, and this kind of shows, and these aren't, these were not the latest, but these are fairly, again, United Nations human. This is like midway through the conflict, I think. So it shows how these flows are staying locally. At this point, I think there's only 4 million, but it shows the 1.9 million coming in Turkey. So if you think, here's the border of Turkey, and you can kind of, sorry, zoom is, there we go. You can kind of see on the right here, it's showing where they go once they come in and the pathway route. So a lot of it is based off geography and military. There are safe routes of passage just from geography, short distances of water. Mountains are going to block you. A mountain pass is a little easier to go through. If there's not a mountain pass, these are mainly people traveling by foot, by boat, by self-motivation. They're not generally being trucked around. But what the spigot really looks like is military patrols and border control procedures. And what happens here is, for example, in Bulgaria, Hungary, some of these, when you see this how it comes up here and it gets this line. What Hungary did is, and it's hard to tell from this map because the map makes it look like it's all flat gray terrain, but these are mountainous areas. So it's actually very difficult to go through Bulgaria and Romania around here. There's a huge mountain range right here. So this is the natural, like if you were just walking around, you would naturally go up and through Hungary this way. And what happens is the spigot is determined by a draw. You have countries like Germany, Sweden, Norway that say, hey, we'll take refugees, but in between them are countries that say, wait a minute, we don't want refugees coming. So a great example of that control is right here on the border of Hungary. Hungary established border controls. We're talking triple fences, heavy security guards. The border controls are also legalistic. When they arrest you, one of the things that they do is, part of the EU conventions and United Nations conventions on refugees is you have to accept asylum seekers. Well, if a country puts its thumb on the scale of the asylum applications and says, we don't accept any of your calls for asylum, they make it legally hard to get asylum in that country to continue through. And so it creates a physical, but also a legal deterrent for crossing in here. So if Hungary caught you and you had not been approved for asylum, they'd give you an asylum hearing. It would probably last a couple minutes, spoken in a language you didn't understand with no attorneys helping you. You'd be declared not to be an asylum seeker and you'd be transferred right back to Serbia. So what happens is these refugee flows move like water. They tend to find the path of least resistance and adapt there. So from where they originally went up and hit this border, they shifted to the left, moved through Bosnia-Herzegovina, which has, Bosnia has a much higher Muslim population, so it's a little bit more sympathetic, allowed them through, and that allowed them to continue the transit up there. Same thing in Turkey, though. When Turkey controls this, first of all, they have refugee camps inside Turkey. They're not the world's greatest, but they're there. If they close down refugee camps and allow people to travel by water and give them food and stuff, they're going to head west in an effort to get to Germany, Norway, which is kind of considered, these destinations are considered, if you get there, life's going to be much easier. They're better asylum treatment, they're better facilities, better, you're coming from a war-torn country and you're kind of like, where do I want to go? I want to go somewhere that's going to be able to support me and my family. Maybe I can make some money, send some back home to the people who are going to come. Turkey, though, when it closes the spigot, they do very intense patrols, naval patrols. They put their military on it, and they use a physical control. That they can't put up a border fence because it's water, but they can make it very difficult to cross this water area here. Is that answering your question, Dana, of some of the mechanisms they use for control?
Absolutely, yeah. It's reminding me that I had a good friend when I was living in Norway who was a Syrian refugee, and he just was so grateful, to finally, literally after months and months and months of travel.
Oh yeah, this will take 6 to 8 months. And the challenge is that the countries along the path may not want you. So some of them take the attitude of, like, Bosnia-Herzegovina is like, hey, great, we'll help you come in, we'll give you some food, we'll make it easy for you, because they want them to keep going. They don't have the ability in the economy to support a lot, so they'll do what they can. Others, like Hungary, will put up a very stiff border, very militaristic, lots of legal controls to make proceedings unfair. This problem almost ripped the European Union apart. The European Union is a federal state, effectively. I mean, it's a collection of sovereign states, but it's supposed to have one standard for travel and international travel within its borders. And this one issue was so contentious, everyone started doing their own thing. It's kind of like the US with the pandemic response. You know, everyone starts doing their own thing, making it up as they go along. And all of a sudden you have Hungary with one system, Bosnia with a different system, Austria has a different, Germany's got something different. And it causes problem where these refugees land too. I tend to be, you know, pro-refugee because I think that the people who are making this travel, they're some of the most, you know, you get to know them and they're worthwhile and they need the help, and there's a huge benefit for helping them out. But I'm not blind to the fact that there's often backlash. So Germany, when this began, Merkel, the leader of Germany, said, yeah, we'll take as many refugees as we got, but she hadn't prepared her population or done the political legwork to get the buy-in and the consensus, and it has created what we might call as a reactionary backlash. So you see anti-immigration laws spike up, you see racism spike up, you see anti-refugees, and one of the things that is contentious, I know, but there are elements of ISIS in these refugee flows. Not many. I would say I can think of maybe less than a handful of incidents, but where bona fide refugees were actually ISIS fighters and went on to conduct attempted suicide attacks or things like that. Now, to me, a couple, like less than 5 out of several million, that's not, you know, there's a risk, but that's a risk we should be able to manage. The benefit of taking these refugees, I think, far outweighs the risk, but that's you know, some people were saying at the time, oh, there's no risk to taking these refugees. That's not true either. And so you have to be, I mean, pragmatically, you have to be very pragmatic and open-eyed when you look at these issues, especially in the context you're doing in this class of international affairs and comparative politics. You need to sort of be realistic about what's going on to be able to assess what's happening and sort of discuss potential solutions. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a mulleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.